Time for back-to-back chapters. Gamut Triskelion looked upon his life like a machine. It wasn't an uncommon conceit amongst the Adeptus Mechanicus. There was a pleasing rhythm and routine to his dealings with the world. He had his clique from the Genitor Order, whom with he worshipped. He had his allotment of regular checks and maintenance procedures about the Palladium. They were less about repair and more about ritual. Several of the machines he was nominally responsible for had not worked for long since before his birth, and in one case, the engine's original function was lost to time. But on each prescribed day, he would run through the long series of checks and tasks, removing and cleansing long-stilled parts, enacting diagnostics, throwing a sequence of components into brief motion. It calmed his mind and enhanced his awareness of the generations of tech priests who had performed these same objectively meaningless tasks before him. It was all a small cog in his routine that allowed everything else to run correctly. His life was a train of such gears, each providing motive power to the next, and at the end of the train was his research. Here was where the machine acted upon the world. Here was where the machine could turn back and improve its own working so as to better approach the perfection of the Omnissiah. It was a tenet of Triskelian's life that nothing which brought his personal machine closer to the immaculate state could be so bad. He was midway through his comforting round of ritual repair when two of his fellow genitors found him, looking grave. Clavin was the younger of the two, although successive grafts of skin meant any attempt telling the man's age was doomed to failure. Some time ago, he had attempted to show that the outer dermis of miners became tougher with their toil and could be harvested to reinforce the necessarily more fragile hides of the tech priests themselves. He had been his own test subject, and in the end had failed to convince Berzelum or even particularly Triskelion. Now he was a patchwork of different skin tones and qualities, ragged edged where his implants and conduits sat. His face was mismatched, one eye pulled half closed, the mouth a crooked zigzag. Triskelion remembered him sewing it. In company with him, constantly, of a necessity, was Herma Sectus on her trolley. She was just a head and the upper half of a torso these days, with one functioning arm and one trailing dud. Behind her truncated thorax was a set of bellows which wheezed and groaned, and a spider web of clear pipes carrying ochre fluids lethargically in and out of her remaining substance. She was very old, and had been Triskelian's own teacher before the accident had robbed the world of most of her. She could have replaced the missing pieces with prosthesis, of course, but the pain of the crushing wounds had triggered a weird kind of aestheticism to her, whereby she claimed eschewing both the flesh and any substantive brought to her closer to the ineffable understanding of the Omnissiah. Each year, it seemed, there was less of her, and one day there would be nothing, and perhaps she would be one with the infinite and find what she was looking for. For now, some of those tubes and ducts led from the trolley to Clavin, who was tasked with pulling her around and keeping her alive. It was a charge he was morosely unenthusiastic about, which usually left Herma dragging behind him at the extent of her cabling. Triskelion looked at the two of them. They weren't much, he was forced to admit, but of all his peers, they were the only ones he could trust. Only they knew just what he had installed in his quarters. The bell-jar prison for the monstrosity, and the nervous little Medicaid, and his heretical science. Gamut, Clavin's voice whispered from between frayed lips. Gamut, terrible news. We're discovered. There was nothing to discover, Herma snapped, rolling to a halt behind him. We are about a perfectly righteous course of examination and investigation. Clavin, you must stop talking. But the Fabricator General. Clavin, let me speak. Your lips are defective. The pair of them would go on like that for as long as he let them, so Triskelion rapped in on the casing of the machine he'd been examining to grab their attention. What, he asked them, has happened? The Fabricator General summons you, Clavin moaned. He knows. He doesn't know. There is nothing to know, came distant chorus from Herma. Clavin picked agitatedly at the seams of his face. One of his less painful habits. We're harboring mutants, he whispered, and heretics. We should have sent them to the furnace, Gamut. There's still time. We could say we were holding them for the Ascension Day. We could take them back to the cells. We could... Enough, Triskelion cut him off. And now this girl, Clavin went on, voice rising to a high whine. She's staff. Someone will notice she's gone. They'll come looking. They'll have come looking. That's why you've been called. This is it, Gamut. He'll do away with our order entirely. You've doomed us. A wickedly sharp spine extended for Herma's trolley and lanced Clavin in the thigh with a crackle of lightning. He spasmed and sat down whimpering. Everything will be well, she told him beneficently. We serve the Omnissiah in this, as in all things. And Triskelion would have been far more reassured by that if it hadn't been her standard line concerning just about anything. She was little more than an echo chamber. Her refusal to physically engage with the world was mirrored more and more with her mental attitude. Everything was destined. Everything would be well. He would receive countless, endless reassurance from her. But it would only be his own voice reflected back to him. He had run through his catechism, examining each tenant, weighing the objections against corruption, against the exhortations to maintain and improve. I serve, he insisted. Even so short a time, what he had teased out of the Xenos gene line opened up such possibilities. How had Berzelham found out? Nothing else knew. Nobody else knew save Clavin and Herma. And for all their fault, neither of them would betray him, unless Berzelham had suspected him, even before any of this had arisen. Unless the Fabricator General had been hunting for an excuse to do away with an ambitious subordinate. They had always been rivals, back in the day, before Berzelham's promotion. Maybe the man had always been looking over what passed for his shoulder. In which case... I will explain, he said quietly, knowing that no amount of explanation would suffice if Berzelham decided to play the Inquisitor in earnest. We will do the Omnissiah's sacred work here. However, it may seem at first, I will convince him. And he answered the summons, knowing that if Berzelham had found out, he most certainly couldn't. So, doing the voices, it's like cool to find a voice, but it's really important to remember it and make it consistent. That way, there's just like instant recognition, because if you're switching around with the voice, you know, it really just throws things off. But Triskelion, he has a physical voice, but they don't speak with their physical voices. They speak in binary. There's like Um, there's like a web around each of them that transmits information. And I mean, to them, it would look like auras and like orbs and circles like flying around everywhere. But they all contain like different packets of information. But it all like it gives everything like it's basically like another layer to reality, and that's how they speak because they can speak so much more rapidly and transmit so much more information so much more precisely. It's um yeah, it's human speech for them is just a it's a leftover something that yeah, I mean it would be it I mean it'd be like us trying to do this but with tin cups or whatever or screw it, even like just a telephone, like it just it's not the same, it's not the same. The Adeptus Mechanicus, they believe that the flesh is weak and that the Omnissiah provides a blueprint for their ascendancy because I mean they can ultimately become immortal if they just keep on replacing components. But that's sort of Triskelian's take is he doesn't want to just replace damaged organic components. He wants to make them stronger so they don't have to be replaced, or at least the ones that can't be replaced, like their spines or their brains. I mean, the brains can be replaced in some form or another, but that gets dangerously close to artificial intelligence. I'm rambling now, but basically Triskelion wants to improve the flesh, while Berzelum, he absins the flesh and he does not want it to be studied at all. He believes that flesh is just weak, like inherently, so it should just be replaced as soon as possible. And of course, not everyone can is that's not available to everyone. It's a sign of status, of course, to fashion that. And of course, Brazilum hadn't. A summons from the Fabricator General meant nothing these days. A minute spent in the man's presence was merely a broken piece of Triskelian's personal machine. Brazilum was a thing of whim, that most unforgivable trait in a tech priest. He survived in his high office because he ensured that those with influence received all the resources and manpower they needed, and the shipments of ore and parts to the wider Imperium were made on time. The man considered himself an administrator. The machinery he tended was of invisible logistics. In the pulpit, he would give sermons likening the Palladium to a great engine that required a constant tuning. That was his justification for repeatedly loading the butts of his disfavor with menial tasks that interrupted their own worship and research. We note that your conscription totals were 8.4% below your predecessors, Brazellum told him when he arrived. Very disappointing. Don't you think, Alloy? Below acceptable parameters. Aloysia was idly disassembling her robot's giant hand, comparing its workings to her own cybernetic equivalent. And of course, there was a reason for the poor results of the pool. He stood very still and waited to see if observation would become accusation. But instead, Brazil's bell like form drifted over to stare at his wall of art reflectively. The offerings were down 7.98% as well, he continued. But I suppose the soft sciences were ever inexact. All that squish and squirm. Unhygienic, Aloysia put in. Do away with them. If only we could, Alloy. What magnificent. How magnificent. To be as pure as your Castellan there. All that inconvenient flesh vanished away. Only our mighty brains left amidst the metal. How much more effectively could we serve the Omnissiah? There was nothing efficient in Brazil's service as far as Triskelion was concerned. His current occupation was a case in point. Here in his own private chambers, were no machines, no laboratory equipment, but luxury. He had a kitchen staffed by servitors who created food he couldn't taste. He had a grand circular window carved out at his order and set with the colors of stained glass his optics couldn't appreciate. And he had his wall of art. It was common knowledge amongst any rogue trader that might pass by Murad that the fabricator general would buy art. He would divert a shocking proportion of mine or factorum output into the holds of any ship that might have brought him a new curio for his damnable wall. There were some geometric pieces, non representational repeating patterns, and tessellations, and these at least Triskelion could appreciate on mathematical grounds. The rest were portraits of imperial dignitaries of ages gone by, and expert renditions of the emperor and his radiance that made the graffiti of the South Chasm look accomplished. Even loot hauled off from Xenot's craft worlds, holograms of fey-looking male and female aliens engaged in corrupt and blasphemous dances or portrayed against unwholesomely verdant landscapes. An inquisitor, Triskelion thought. An inquisitor would have a field day. Here was the true corruption. Not the diligent search for truth Triskelion was conducting in his lab, except that, as long as Murad kept producing, no inquisitor would come here. The world was itself just a cog, and if it wobbled under Bazelm's hand, it would remain with intolerance. We have another job for you, Visceral. Try to be better with this one, won't you? Bazelm half revolved to peer at him, the living sections of his face set in smile, with what was at least 5 parts sneer. Oh, I know your research, your little projects. Well, we have a small engagement called Ascension Day. Only happens once every couple decades or so. You should check your calendar more often. All hands to the pumps, isn't that right, Aloysia? Maybe he doesn't understand pumps. Tell him it's like those organic things, hearts or lungs or some such. Maybe he'll understand better. Some sort of organ, Triskelion. We need you to massage it, or whatever one does with organs. Such inconvenient things. We're glad we've had most of them taken out, aren't we? Indubitably, Fabricator General. What is it, Triskelion interrupted, that you wish me to do, Fabricator General? Because this sort of thing could go on for a while. Oh, well, the entertainment, obviously, Bazelm told him airily. And to welcome the returning Skitari, our gallant heroes come home to collect their new recruits. They must be properly received while we make our offerings. Let us plan and schedule, won't you? We hereby delegate you Chief Festivator, Visceral. Really, it's an honor. A job where you can keep your hands clean. You should be grateful. Speaking of hands, how's the new one turning out? Surprised you've still got a flesh one left. Really, now you've tried the alternative. And here was a servitor, proffering a grand scroll of small but time-eating tasks, all apparently the duties of the newly appointed chief festivator. A month of trivialities to be accomplished in days. Fabricator General, Fabricator General, Triskelion groaned out. I am the senior Magos Biologos on Marad. I am more than qualified to act as locum for this entire world. I should have been Fabricator General, not you, he thought. I have contributions to make to this collected knowledge of our order. And you give me this? Bazelm rotated until he was facing Triskelion. Alloy, he said lightly. This Cyril thinks he's too good for us. Aloysia clicked her tongue ringedly against the tungsten roof of her mouth and replaced the robot's hand. The towering metal form took a step forwards, putting Triskelion in its shadow. We don't want your knowledge. It's unclean. It seeps organic juices and breeds maggots, Berzelm told him. It would have you all flesh prodders. I would have all you fresh prodders off my world if I could. Contributions, you say? What have you ever done except dabbled your fingers in corpses? Stiff with dignity, Triskelion allowed himself a calming breath before replying. I refer to the Fabricator General, to my past submissions to the archives. Both the medical and the immunological lore I have recovered and translated, and my own treatise on how our current knowledge might be furthered. I have filed no fewer than 19 proposals for research ventures. I have myself developed a novel suppressant gel that permits 9.9% improved annealing between biological and mechanical tissues. All these developments are doubtless now making the Imperium a more ordered, more effective. No one cares. Berzelm cut him off, waving it all away and burlesquing boredom. Visceral, do you honestly think I ever sent any of that on? Mars doesn't want your squishing and your fluids. They want the purity of steel. And from us, they want our ore and our components and nothing more. Triskellion's prosthetic hand spasmed and tore a gash in his robe. He kept his face entirely still. You didn't send anything I submitted for the Martian archives? You didn't even send? And yet, the Imperium somehow survives, Berzelm marked dryly. It's almost as if it wasn't really interesting after all. Don't you think, Alloy? That's my life's work, Triskelion choked. Oh, really? My, that is rather depressing, don't you think? Claiming that miserable little heap of intestines is your life's work. And now you think you're fit to be my locum rather than dear Alloy here? And take over from me in time? And turn Marad into a Charnel house? You would doubly be grateful. I've made you chief festivator. Otherwise, what in the world would you even have to show for all that time? Incredibly, Triskelion managed to bow quite politely and turn and stride before the fabricator's presence to walk smartly back towards his own chambers, and all without letting out the incandescent rage that was seething inside. So there are three factions, and the two, I mean, just looking at the cover, it could be surmised. You know, there's the terrible gene stealers, right? I mean, I guess you can't really see the other faction, but yeah, it's mainly from their perspective. They're actually the protagonists in this. You know, they're like terrible, like alien hybrids that infect worlds just to like subvert them and prepare them for consumption by the great like organic fleets. Like they're agents of like just basically downfall and destruction. And then there's the Mechanicum, who we just who I did the voices for, but then there's Triskelion and his friends. They're not necessarily good guys because they did like kidnap all of Davian's friends and like her brother and Dr. Tesling and that one guy, he just has like a patchwork of different like faces that he's just taken off different people just to see like if it would somehow make him tougher. They did terrible things, but they're more neutral than evil or good because they're not. It's almost like the argument like, okay, and it's not like good or bad. I mean, it's kind of messed up either way though. It's like people don't like cows being eaten, right, in mass. So what if we just stopped? Like, what if we just stopped right now? Just all the houses. What would happen to all those cows? Right? Like what? In a way, in one like in one tiny minute, it's not even silver lining. It's more like bronze or copper lining. At least there's a cow. At least cows exist. There's a cow population that exists, and without that like massive production, that and then that's basically people are the cattle in this book. So it's the anyways like that's kind of they're in the center in that regard in that regard. And also it makes them more susceptible to being corrupted by the gene stealers. And instead of just like throwing them all like all the captured ones into the flames, he's like experimenting with them. That's I guess it's not necessarily neutral, but it's more neutral than just consigning them all to the flames. Before it had been gifted to the Mechanicus as use as a forge world, Murad had been just a mining planet, laboring within the Imperium. It had always been a hard place to live, but the miners had done their best and grown their own rituals. The Emperor's ships had come in their regular round, seeking Murad's stockpiled mineral wealth. And to coincide with the event, that they held a certain ceremony to commemorate all their many dead, and to give the bodies of the recently deceased to their furnaces. It had been a way of coping with the appalling conditions of the world they had been born to. Ascension Day, the metal lifting off into the sky to be turned into the armor and weapons of the Imperium's troops, the smoke rising from the fires to follow them, as though the dead, who had also served the Imperium, were being taken to their own reward. When the Mechanicus had come and reshaped the world and its society for their own purposes, Ascension Day had persisted. The great interlocking puzzle that was the priesthood's calendar could always accommodate a new component. The ships still came for their due, after all. The great liners were in orbit even now, and with them came transports to take away the young and the strong, for the Emperor and for the Forge Lords. No difference between the flesh and blood tithe and the mineral ore one. Everything was just fuel for the great engine that was the Imperium, and every world must contribute. And all I ever wanted to do was contribute, Triskelion told himself furiously. And he had discoveries and resurrections and innovations all laid before the feet of his superiors and cast away, thrown into the recycling vats the moment his back was turned. All this time, he at least hoped his words might find an audience on Mars or elsewhere eventually. That even strangled and stamped down a Murad, he might yet have a legacy in the wider Imperium. But Berzelum had killed that hope. Each day Triskelion had stood before him, and he hadn't even known. How the man must have laughed every time he knew Triskelion's latest work would be thrown to the fire. And Triskelion was on the brink of something he knew, and that something was terrible in its implications. But it was an opportunity too. If only he was permitted to peruse the knowledge and communicate it free of Berzelum's stifling shadow, He would rather have found some clean solution that had no whiff of the Xenos to it, but this was the chance that fate had dealt him. He could either explore this unexpected avenue of research or consign himself to the refuse of history. Chief Festivator, a nonsense title, a court fool for Brazellam's pleasure, giving him trivial bean counting tasks so that he could be publicly criticized for not performing them perfectly. Triskelian's living heart and lungs and innards felt cold in a fit of rage at the indignity. I have important work to be getting on with. And he had to advance that work quickly, because he couldn't exactly hold on to his prisoners forever. Not good, Inspector. How refreshing. Milk. It goes well with the pot, I'll tell you. He met with a delegation of Skitarii from the ships above. The sons and daughters of Murad, come home at last. How many years later? Travel through the warp was unreliable at best. This squad could have been from a century ago, or from only 20 years, without anyone realizing the drift in time. And because the universe was vast, and the Imperium was ordered by 1,000 routines and rituals, it didn't really matter which conscription pool had first taken up these particular children of Murad for modification. Were just skillfully connected to their alpha, their internal architecture was all compatible with his instruction. Designation, he snapped at their leader, and the man stepped toward and genuflected with crisp precision. Alpha Primus, 10 Tangram, adept. A veteran of many worlds, Triskelion supposed, cybernetics showing signs of repair under adverse conditions. He was momentarily fascinated to compare and contrast the internal structure of the whole detachment's decision trees and command architecture, which had shifted and streamlined itself under battlefield conditions. Pit Tin Tanagen's force here against 3 times as many of Murad's ground-bound regulars, and he would destroy them with brutal efficiency. The very thought was almost enough for Triskelion to schedule a test of it, just for the data that might result. Except I have these clownish duties eating my time, Triskelion thought. Another stab of anger, and something must have leaked through the diagnostic link between Tin Tangram. Adept? Triskelion stared at him and his cohort for a long time, their metal parts polished to a gleam, their robes newly woven by the autolooms, carbines slanted across steel shoulders. Their internal subsystems lay open for inloading of whatever instructions he wished. Brazellam wanted them at the feast, wanted the flames from the burning offerings reflected in the lenses of their eyes, and the Fabricator General would eat and smirk with his favorites. And he'd go out on short-changing the universe, spinning Murad's wealth like water for his loathsome art. He'd go on standing between truly observant priests and their full potential. Nothing would ever change. Gamut Triskelion would become no more than a footnote in the annals of an inefficient world, his genius wasted. And I could have been Fabricator General. I have the seniority. If not for him, what wonders we might have already unearthed. Without giving himself time to regret, Triskelion cued commands within his mind. Nothing actionable, nothing treasonous, unorthodox perhaps, but with intolerance. Just another wobbly cog in the creaking edifice of Murad, establishing a new hierarchy for the remaining Skitarii, so that all commands pass through one Gamut Triskelion, sole gatekeeper for their thoughts and actions. After all, am I not the chief festivator? he thought bleakly, and then did nothing with it. Not yet. That was just what if. And he didn't need to fret about the implications of what he'd put into place. Not until he finally took an irrevocable step and used it. After that, he went to further interrogate Dr. Tesling. The man's useful lifespan was shortening like a fuse, and Triskelion wanted results. Because he was increasingly convinced there were results to be had, the little Medicaid cringed satisfactorily when he re entered. Clavin and Herma had him scribbling away, defacing a pristine scroll with a scrawl of his hand. Triskelion strode over and tore the most recent writing from under the man's hand. What even is this? Oh. What even is this? We have him reporting on the methodology used in his laboratory, Clavin limped on, Herma rattling along behind him. It was not, Tesling said quietly, a laboratory. It was my clinic. I helped these people. I made them well. And this monster is... well? Is he? Triskelion placed a hand on the armor-glass and met the baleful, three-eyed stare of the thing within. He was aware of the little clerk watching him from the smaller jar he'd hauled in for her. She was practically human, though, and didn't interest him as much. He would have died, Tesling insisted. I have saved him. You have damned him, Herma declared, sanctimoniously. And there is to be... but there may be something to be derived from your method. The flesh thus treated shows a remarkable resilience. She prodded Clavin with a crackle, Clavin with a crackle, and unraveled another scroll. His own results from samples torn and carved from the monster's flesh, subjected to every manner of stress and damage. And that was what interested Triskelion. What was it that limited the legions of the Adeptus Mechanicus, that prevented them from triumphantly rising against any odds? Berzelum would say it was the flesh, and this Triskelion would actually agree. The flesh that could not be excised. The living parts that remained, even in Skitarii, when everything else had been cored out and scored away. Better mechanics would not make a better soldier or a wiser priest, because the chain was the mercy of its weakest link. The flesh that could not be replaced must be rendered less vulnerable. And if there was ever a world to serve as a laboratory for that experiment, it was Marad. There were 1,000 poisons in the soil and the rock of this planet, and the miners constantly inhaled and ingested. And still they mined, because the same elements that killed were the most valuable for the adepts in the Imperium. Marad was a forge world, in more ways than one. It was the hammer and the anvil that flesh was beaten on. What was your recovery rate? Not for aberrations like this, but for your regular subjects, Triskelion asked idly. Patients, Tesling replied. They were patients. And then Triskellion's hand cuffed him, and he cringed. But at least 4 out of 10 lived, and after being brought to me. For tech pre-surgery, the survival rate was dismal, but it was likely 10 times but it was likely 10 times what the average laborer in Marad might expect. And these were your kin? My siblings, Adept. My people. The invasive surgeries Tesling's records attested to should have left his victims bleeding out on the table, or needing the sort of prosthesis the other tech priests reserved for their own. And yet, Many of them lived, and Triskelion knew why. His patients weren't human. Something he was unwilling to say out loud, even here, hedging it out with words like atypical and anomalous. Yet the conclusion was inescapable. An alien taint had infiltrated Murad and spread undetected until its most recent scions were human enough to get work as clerks at the Palladium. And Triskelion should have gone running to Brazilum with the news and then organized an incendiary strike to obliterate even entire districts of the South Chasm down to deep bedrock. Even that, except that he knew Brazilum would mock him for the news and give him no credit for his vigilance. Except that he poured over Tesling's results, the strength of the flesh. And it was alien flesh, but it was human flesh too. These were no brute orcs made of deviant vegetal matter, utterly inimical to human biology. This was a strain of the Xenos that could infiltrate its way into human cells and form an uneasy truce between the familiar and the strange. A compatibility against all logic that produced an end result, the virtues of both. And Triskelion had recoiled from the thought. Impurity of impurities. But he had not consigned Testling to the fire. And now he looked over Testling's scrawlings. The man's understanding of his own craft almost despaired. How do you know what treatments to give? You must have a better grasp of how the atypical elements respond to these chemicals. Your own results speak to that, and yet this is gibberish. Reading over the man's desperate scratchings of dosage and administration, he felt the frustration of his earlier interview wash over him and pincered Testling's shoulder so hard with his metal fingers. Tell me how you know what to do. The Medicaid let out a choked sound of pain. It speaks to me, he ground out. Then I know what to give them, to save them. What speaks to you? Triskelion demanded, looking at Clavin and Herma for support. The us in them, Tessling gasped. Speaks to us in me. And we know each other, and I know how strong they are and how much to give them. Not good enough, Triskelion snapped, because that was of no use to him. He didn't want this alien flesh giving commands. He needed obedient, predictable, pinned down in numbers and calculations, and replicable results. We will tame it like a beast, Triskelion thought. Like some sweating, daft animal, co-opted to draw the ordinance of the Astra Militarum, save that it would be enslaved within human cells. Clavin's initial tests already showed the hybrid flesh was resistant to the toxins and radiation of Murad. Triskelion's own experiments suggested it might be far more able to keep up with Skitarii cybernetics, a stronger link in that chain. And Triskelion believed the strength of human purity. He sang along to the Imperial Creed that humanity was superior and that the Xenos was weak and deviant and fit to be purged. But if humanity was superior and the Xenos was weak, then there would only be one outcome when they met and grappled within the human cell. It will speak when it is spoken to, he told Tessling. It will render up its information to our instruments, not to this thing within you. Or you are of no use to us. Do you understand? You will make this resilience in your own flesh obedient. You do not understand what we are. There was a flash of spirit in Tesling's eyes, as though the alien thing within him rose momentarily to the surface. I have read sufficient texts to know you, Triskelion told him, diversively, derisively. In truth, those old scrolls he had been able to find were incomplete and had precious little to say. Certainly, his order had encountered infections such as this in the past, written of it in veiled terms and maddening illusions. They had always sought to exterminate it, by those records, even down to salting the earth of whole continents in some worlds. Blind, Triskelion decided bitterly, as the void of vision is Brazilum. You are merely human stock, adulterated by some alien bacillus or parasite. The taint within you will work for the human cells it inhabits, just as your bodies are set to work for our greater purpose. Or they will be purged. As without, so within. He suppressed a shudder of revulsion, telling himself, this could be the greatest advantage. This could be the greatest advance of the age. And in his mind, always, Brazilum chuckling and bobbling and denying him a chance to be the visionary he knew he should be. A bleak hand settled on his heart, a pain so physical and immediate he wished he'd got the organ cut out and replaced long before. It wouldn't matter. All the advantage he could wring from this discovery, everything he was risking his very soul to uncover, it would be wasted. It would be ground beneath Brazilum's many iron feet. Triskelion was on the brink of a discovery that might give the soldiers of the tech priests the keys that conquer and perfect the universe. And to Brazilum, it would be just soft sciences, and he would bury it. Brazilum wastes my potential, he thought. He denies me a chance to worship the Omnissiah, the only proper way. Through knowledge of the Fabricator General, with scorn. He is the misaligned component in Rod's machine. Without him, everything would run so smoothly. And with that, he understood the use he could put to that prying little clerk, too.